Alcatraz, the island you cannot escape. Chapter 1, that will not let go. You can see San Francisco from Alcatraz. You can see the lights. On a clear night, you can even make out the shape of the hills. For a prisoner, that distance is not a mile. It is a cruel measurement of hope. Alcatraz shut down as a federal prison in 1963, not because it suddenly grew compassionate, but because it was too expensive and too broken to keep running. And yet, the island refuses to stay in the past. In May 2025, President Donald Trump announced plans to rebuild and reopen Alcatraz as a prison, framing it as a symbol of law and order. The proposal was widely criticized as impractical, but the moment it was said out loud, it proved something important. Alcatraz is not just a place. It is a story machine. Every generation returns to it when the country is arguing about fear, punishment, and who deserves to be locked away. Say the name, and people picture steel doors. Say the name and people feel the cold. Tonight, we are going to open 3 doors. The first door is geography. The second door is myth. The third door is memory. And by the end, you will understand why Alcatraz keeps coming back, even when the doors have been welded shut for more than half a century. If you like historical documentaries that feel like a thriller, stay with me, because the most unsettling thing about Alcatraz is not the steel. It is how easily we learn to love the idea of it. Chapter 2, the first door, geography as a weapon. Before Alcatraz was a prison, it was a name spoken by sailors. In 1775, during Spain's exploration of the bay, the island was labeled Isla de los Alcatraces, commonly translated as Island of the Pelicans or Seabirds. The exact birds do not matter as much as the mood. This was a rock for creatures that belonged to wind and water, not to people. But American history has a habit. When the state finds a strategic piece of land, it asks one question: how can we use this to control the future? Alcatraz is small, steep, and exposed. It sits in the bay like a clenched fist. Fog can swallow it. Sun can bleach it. Salt can eat it. The island does not feel like a place where anything should last. And that is precisely why it works. A prison is not only walls. A prison is distance. A prison is effort. A prison is the exhausting knowledge that the world is right there and you cannot touch it. Alcatraz is close enough to the city to tempt you, and far enough to punish you for being tempted. Look at a map of the bay and you see the trap. Currents move with power and unpredictability. Water temperatures punish the body. At night, visibility collapses. In fog, direction becomes a guess. This is the first secret of Alcatraz. It never needed to be perfect. It needed to feel inevitable. When power wants obedience, it does not only build walls, it chooses terrain that makes resistance look like madness. And once the walls exist, the next step is simple. You find people to put behind them. Chapter 3, Fortress Years. When the island learned to command, in the 1,850 seconds, Alcatraz began transforming into a military site. Fortifications rose on a surface that never asked to be civilized. Cannons were positioned to guard the entrance to San Francisco Bay. The island became part of a defensive network built on a new national anxiety: the fear of invasion, the fear of losing the gate to the Pacific. Then came the lighthouse. In 1854, Alcatraz lit up with what is widely described as the first lighthouse on the west coast of the United States. Think about that. The earliest beacon on that coastline was built on a rock that would later become a symbol of confinement, light and captivity, born in the same place. The lighthouse said, "Come safely." The fort said, "Do not come at all." And the island itself did the rest. Everything had to be hauled up by hand. Supplies, guns, stone, timber. The weather never cooperated for long. This was not a comfortable outpost. It was a demanding one. That matters because it sets the tone. Alcatraz was never meant to be easy. It was meant to be useful. Useful things, in the hands of governments, rarely stay gentle. Once Alcatraz became a fort, the idea of using it to hold people was inevitable. If you can control a gate, you can control a body. If you can command a shoreline, you can command a life. By the late 1,850 seconds and into the Civil War era, the island was already functioning as a place of confinement for military purposes. The building that later became the famous cell house has roots in those early 20th century Army disciplinary barracks. In other words, the prison did not appear out of nowhere in 1934. It evolved. And that evolution is important because it reveals a truth. Alcatraz did not become a prison because it was cruel. It became a prison because it was convenient. The island offered three advantages that no mainland facility could match: separation, visibility, and fear. Separation means fewer escape routes. Visibility means easier control. Fear means fewer people want to try. Chapter 4. The Federal Penitentiary is born. 1934. And the age of crime panic. By the early 1932s, the United States was living in a storm. The Great Depression had crushed millions. Organized crime had become a national obsession. Bank robbers and kidnappers became household names. The public wanted reassurance. The government wanted a symbol. In 1933, the Department of Justice acquired the site for use as a federal prison. In 1934, Alcatraz reopened as a maximum security federal penitentiary. This was not a normal prison. It was designed to remove problems from other prisons. Men labeled as violent. Men labeled as escape risks. Men labeled as too influential inside inmate populations. Alcatraz did not exist to rehabilitate. It existed to concentrate control. The formula was simple: isolation plus routine plus certainty. Make every day predictable. Make every movement counted. Make every corner visible. From the first moment a prisoner arrived, the island did part of the work for the institution. The water told him what the rules meant. You can fight a guard, you can cut a bar, but you cannot negotiate with the tide. That is why Alcatraz mattered as theater. A prison does not only hold inmates, it sends messages to the outside world. The message of Alcatraz was meant to be short. You are not in control here. The state is, and for a while, it worked. Or at least it appeared to work, because the reputation mattered as much as reality. The country needed a myth, a place where the government always wins. Chapter 5. How to build a myth, routine, rules, and the psychology of control. Alcatraz became famous because it sounded final. People called it The Rock. People called it America's Devil Island. And what makes a nickname powerful is not accuracy. It is emotion. Inside, life was defined by rules. Prisoners woke early. Meals happened on schedule. Counts happened again and again. Work assignments filled the day. Silence and compliance were treated like survival skills. The cells were small and stark. A bed, a desk, a basin, a toilet. No comfort, no privacy, no illusion of softness. Even basic amenities were limited for much of the prison's life. This is what modern punishment often looks like. Not constant beating, constant stricture. Structure so strict it becomes psychological pressure. A man can endure pain if it ends, but sameness feels endless. Sameness teaches you that time belongs to someone else. The dining hall became a ritual of control. Movement was regulated. Where you sat was regulated. When you could speak was regulated. Every detail said the same thing. You are counted. You are watched. You do not choose. And yet, Alcatraz was also a contradiction. Because it was designed to be harsh, but it was also designed to be orderly. Order is expensive. Order requires staff. Order requires maintenance. Order requires a building that does not fall apart. Alcatraz demanded all of that on an island that never stopped corroding. Then, the press performed the final step of myth building. It turned prisoners into characters. Alcatraz held men who were already famous. Al Capone, the gangster whose name was printed like a warning. Robert Stroud, later branded the Birdman of Alcatraz, a story that grew larger than the man. The prison's leadership understood the effect. A notorious prisoner served the myth. A prison that holds famous men becomes famous itself. And fame, once created, becomes hard to contain. Because myth attracts one question, like a magnet. Can anyone escape? Alcatraz claimed that no prisoner ever successfully escaped. But the truth is more complicated. There were many attempts. Some ended in gunfire. Some ended in drowning. Some ended with men crawling back onto the rocks, exhausted and defeated. The prison's own records and later summaries describe 36 men involved in 14 separate escape attempts during the federal penitentiary era. Most were caught, killed, or drowned. But the point is not the numbers. The point is the instinct. If you lock a human being in a box, he will spend his days studying the seams. And by the early 1960s, the seams were everywhere, not only in the human spirit, In the building itself, Chapter 6, The Island of Escape Attempts. When the seams begin to show, for almost 30 years, men tested Alcatraz. Some tests were crude, a man climbing a fence, bullets cracking the air. Some were clever, a uniform assembled from stolen pieces, a ferry boarded at the right moment, a plan built on confidence and misdirection. And sometimes the attempts were violent. In May 1946, a failed escape attempt erupted into what became known as the Battle of Alcatraz. Inmates seized weapons and took hostages. A standoff followed. Guards were killed and many were wounded. The attempt failed, but the myth of perfect control did not leave unscarred. Incidents like that reveal a deeper truth. The prison may be an institution of control, but it is also a fragile environment. When control breaks, it breaks loudly. Alcatraz could punish. Alcatraz could isolate. Alcatraz could enforce routine, but it could not erase the oldest instinct on Earth. People want to get out. Sometimes they want to get out to run. Sometimes they want to get out just to prove they still can choose. That is why, even in a place like Alcatraz, the staff did not only watch prisoners, they watched boredom, they watched frustration, they watched the slow build of obsession, and the island itself added pressure. Salt air chewed at metal, moisture attacked concrete, fog and wind punished anything exposed. Every year, the building demanded repairs, and repairs demanded money. This is the quiet side of Alcatraz that movies rarely show. Decay, budget sheets, barges carrying supplies, work crews fighting corrosion as if fighting the ocean, because Alcatraz was never just a prison. It was an expensive machine sitting on a rock. Then, on one night in June 1962, the machine was tricked in a way that turned it into legend. Chapter 7, Rehook, The Night the Beds Lied. Picture the cell block at night. Lights out. The building quiet, but never truly asleep. Guards walking a pattern they have walked 1,000 times. A glance into a cell, a shape under a blanket, a head on a pillow, everything normal, except it was not a man on that bed. It was a model, a face built to resemble life, just enough to survive the most dangerous thing in Alcatraz. The quick look of a tired guard. That is how the most famous escape in the prison's history began. Not with a roar, but with a lie made of plaster and patience. Chapter 8, The June 1962 Escape. 3 men into the fog. The date is the 11th of June, 1962. The names are Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. They did not wake up one morning and decide to escape. They prepared for months. They studied routine. They collected materials. They built tools. They watched the building the way a mechanic watches a machine. Their plan relied on 2 truths. First, the prison depended on habit. Guards checked, but they checked in predictable ways. The system was strict, but strictness can become repetitive. Repetition creates blind spots. Second, the cell house was old. In places, the structure was weakened by time and salt. Vents, utility corridors, and maintenance spaces existed behind the visible prison. Alcatraz was a stage, but stages always have backstage areas. They created dummy heads for their beds. According to FBI accounts, the heads were made with plaster, paint, and real human hair, convincing enough to fool night guards. Then they went to work on the real exit. They enlarged openings near their vents. They slipped into corridors not meant for prisoners. They climbed through the building like ghosts moving inside its bones. They reached the roof. They moved across the top of the cell house under the open sky. They navigated down toward the shoreline, and in a blind spot, away from searchlights and towers, they prepared a makeshift raft. Near midnight, they disappeared into the bay. The escape was not discovered until the next morning. During the routine early bed check, a guard approached a cell to wake a prisoner, and the head on the pillow did not behave like a human head. The dummy shifted. The dummy fell. The truth fell with it. The prison snapped into alarm. Lockdown. Search teams. Boats. Floodlights. Orders shouted into fog. And still, the 3 men were gone. For days, the search continued. Debris was found. Items were recovered. The water gave hints without answers. And then the case entered its second life. The life where no one can prove the ending. Did they drown? Did they reach shore? Did they disappear into the world as new men? The FBI described the escape as one of the most famous cases in its history. The most likely outcome, many investigators argued, was that the bay killed them, but uncertainty never died. Because in a story like this, uncertainty is oxygen. The escape did something no riot and no violence had fully accomplished. It injured the myth. Alcatraz was supposed to be the place that ends stories. But on the 11th of June, 1962, it became the place that begins one. A national mystery. A question that refuses to close. And when a myth turns into a question, it becomes stronger, not weaker. Chapter 9. Why the Mystery Matters. Certainty is a government product. A prison runs on certainty. Certainty tells guards what to do. Certainty tells the public that order exists. Certainty tells lawmakers that fear can be managed. Mystery does the opposite. Mystery invites interpretation. It invites obsession. It invites a person to decide what they want to believe. Some people want to believe the state always wins. So they say the men drowned, end of story. Some people want to believe human ingenuity can crack any system. So they imagine the raft slipping into darkness, reaching a quiet shore, and three men blending into the world. In reality, evidence is tangled and the bay is unforgiving. But the cultural effect is clear. The June 1962 escape turned Alcatraz into a legend that can be rewritten by anyone who tells it. And that is dangerous. Because legends can be used. They can be used to sell fear. They can be used to justify harshness. They can be used to polish punishment until it looks like safety. Now remember what we said in the hook. Alcatraz is a story machine. After 1962, the machine changed. It no longer produced only obedience. It produced fascination, and fascination is a kind of power. Meanwhile, the institution was already wobbling. The buildings were aging. Concrete was failing in spots. Steel corroded. Repairs piled up. The island demanded constant maintenance. And maintenance demanded money. This is where the story becomes brutally unromantic. Alcatraz did not have its own source of fresh water. Supplies had to be transported by boat. Historical accounts describe that even water had to be barged to the island, on a scale so large it becomes hard to imagine. The Bureau of Prisons later emphasized that closure was not caused by the disappearance of Morris and the Anglin brothers, because the decision to close had been made long before. Alcatraz closed because it was too expensive to keep running, and because the institution needed millions of dollars in restoration and maintenance. So on the 21st of March, 1963, the federal prison closed. The last inmates were transferred. The guards left. The doors shut, but the story did not shut with them, because Alcatraz still had one more transformation. A transformation that would flip its meaning in a way no warden could control. Chapter 10. The Second Door. Myth becomes a market. Here is what happens when a famous prison closes. First, it becomes quiet. Then it becomes empty. Then it becomes vulnerable. In the years after 1963, Alcatraz was not immediately a polished tourist site. It was an abandoned complex on a rock. And abandoned places attract the same thing everywhere in the world. Trespassers, vandals, people who want to touch history without permission, people who want to steal pieces of it. The island entered a strange limbo. No longer a working prison. Not yet a protected museum. A landmark without a script. That limbo is important because it shows how fragile history is. If enough people decide an old building is worthless, it disappears. Not by demolition crews at first, but by neglect. By broken windows. By rust. By theft. By time. And yet, Alcatraz did not disappear. Why? Because the myth was already too big. Alcatraz had become a national symbol, and symbols create pressure. Pressure to preserve. Pressure to interpret. Pressure to monetize. If the public will pay to see the cell house, someone will eventually sell the ticket. But before the ferry lines, before the audio tours, before the souvenirs, there was a different group that saw the island as useful, not as entertainment, as a statement. Chapter 11. The Third Door. Memory takes the island. The occupation of 1969 to 1971. In November 1969, Alcatraz was occupied by a group calling themselves Indians of all tribes. They were Native American activists and supporters who understood symbolism. They chose a place already loaded with meaning. They chose the rock because the rock was famous. And if you want the country to pay attention, you choose a stage the country cannot ignore. The occupation began on the 20th of November, 1969, and lasted until the 11th of June, 1971. A place built to isolate people, to remove them from public life, became a stage for a movement demanding visibility. The same rock that held prisoners now held protest. The same walls that once meant silence now carried messages. Later, the National Park Service would describe Alcatraz with a phrase that captures the flip: island of incarceration, island of freedom. The occupation was part of a wider surge of native activism in the United States. It drew attention to broken treaties, federal policies, and the reality of indigenous life in an America that often preferred to forget. It was messy. It was contested. It included internal tensions and outside pressure. But it forced the country to look, and in the long run, it helped reshape public conversation. That is why this chapter belongs in the Alcatraz story, because it proves Alcatraz is not only about punishment, it is about who gets to define the meaning of a place. When a society turns a prison into a symbol of rights, it is admitting something. Places are not fixed. They can be reinterpreted. They can be fought over. Alcatraz was no longer only a warning. It became a question about who gets to speak and who is forced to stay quiet. Chapter 12. The Park That Saved the Prison. In 1972, Alcatraz Island was transferred to the Department of the Interior to become part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It became a historic site managed by the National Park Service. This is where the story takes on its most American shape. Private power builds monuments to itself. Public institutions later decide whether those monuments deserve to survive. A prison, once a tool of control, becomes a museum, and a museum turns fear into tickets, audio guides, and photographs. People line up for the ferry. They ride across water that once promised death to escapees. They walk up the hill. They enter the cell house. They stand in narrow corridors and imagine the sound of keys. They listen to recorded memories from former guards and inmates. They stare at the bars and feel a safe shiver. The island becomes entertainment, but it can also become education if we let it. Because Alcatraz contains layers. It is a story of military expansion and coastal defense. It is a story of the federal government responding to crime panic. It is a story of human beings enduring isolation. It is a story of resistance, both criminal and political. It is a story of budgets and decay. It is a story of how myths are manufactured. And it is a story that can be repurposed again and again, depending on what the country wants to argue about. Chapter 13. When a ghost becomes a policy. Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Alcatraz is supposed to be finished. It is supposed to belong to history, a closed chapter. But in May 2025, President Donald Trump said he would rebuild and reopen Alcatraz as a prison. He directed federal agencies to pursue the idea. Supporters treated it as a tough message. Critics called it unserious and wildly impractical. Whether or not it could happen is not the point. The point is that the symbol still works. In a country worried about crime, the image of Alcatraz is a shortcut. You do not need a policy paper. You just need the rock. That is the power of myth. And it is exactly why we should be careful with it. Because myths do not ask whether something is feasible. Myths ask whether it feels right. And the more fearful a society becomes, the more tempting it is to reach for a symbol that promises certainty. Chapter 14. Why Alcatraz Closed. The boring details that change everything. If you want to understand Alcatraz honestly, you have to step away from the movies. You have to look at the parts that are not cinematic. Fresh water, electricity, sewage, heating, maintenance. Alcatraz sits on an island with no natural fresh water supply. Historically, water had to be transported to the island. Everything had to be transported to the island. Food, fuel, building materials, medical supplies. A mainland prison can call a truck. Alcatraz had to call a boat. High costs were not a side issue. They were the core problem. The Bureau of Prisons said millions of dollars were needed just to restore and maintain the facility. History sources describe the operation as far more expensive than other federal prisons, because the island demanded constant shipments and constant repairs. Add another factor. Alcatraz was relatively small. It had a capacity of 336 inmates. From a bureaucratic perspective, it was a difficult machine that served a limited purpose. And after the June 1962 escape, security confidence shook, not because the escape alone forced closure, but because it highlighted decay and vulnerability in a facility already struggling. So, on the 21st of March 1963, the federal prison closed. Now, pause and ask, If Alcatraz closed because it was expensive and deteriorating, why does the country keep fantasizing about reopening it? Because what many people want from Alcatraz is not a prison. They want a symbol. They want the feeling that danger can be shipped away. They want a place where harshness looks like certainty. Chapter 15. Inside the system. Routine, control, and the psychology of isolation. Imagine waking up every day to the same view. Concrete. Bars. A corridor that swallows sound. Alcatraz did not depend on constant chaos. It depended on constant sameness. The daily routine mattered. So did the counts. Repeated again and again. A count is a simple act. A guard looks, a number is confirmed. A human being is reduced to presence or absence. A place like Alcatraz teaches you that your body belongs to the schedule. Your thoughts might be free, but your movements are not. For some inmates, that pressure created obedience. For others, it created obsession. An obsession with escape. Not always because escape was realistic, but because imagining escape was the only form of control left. That is why prisoners studied details. The time it took a guard to turn a corner, the places where sound carried, the way fog gathered, the way tools were stored, the places where rust weakened a hinge. A prison can lock the door, but a prison cannot lock curiosity. And the more the institution insists it is unbreakable, the more it invites challenge. Not always by the strongest men, often by the most patient. This is why the June 1962 escape remains the heart of the Alcatraz myth. It was not a brute force event. It was a quiet argument made through preparation. It said, your system relies on habit, and habit can be exploited. Even if the men drowned, the idea did not. The idea escaped. And once an idea escapes, you cannot bring it back to its cell. Chapter 16. The bay, the fourth wall of the prison. Everything about Alcatraz depends on the water. If the island were on land, it would be a harsh prison, but not a legend. The bay is what turns it into something mythical. The bay is cold. The currents are unpredictable. Fog can hide a raft and also hide rescue. The same water that protects the prison also threatens everyone who works there. Guards and staff lived with that reality too. They commuted by boat. They watched weather. They watched the tide. They watched the island become a different world when the fog came down. That matters because it shows Alcatraz was not only punishment for inmates, it was a demanding assignment for staff. A prison on an island is a prison for everyone on the island, just in different forms. And this is why closure was always coming. An island prison is a logistical problem that never stops. You can patch cracks. You can repaint walls. But you cannot change the fact that the building sits in salt air. In the end, the sea always collects its fee. Even after the prison closed, the sea kept working. It kept corroding. It kept peeling paint. It kept pushing the island toward ruin. Preservation became a race against nature. Chapter 17. The Tourist Island. The price of remembering. People visit Alcatraz to feel something. They want to feel the chill of the cell house. They want to feel the weight of isolation, safely, for an hour. They want to stand near a cell and imagine a life reduced to a narrow rectangle. Feeling is one way history enters the body, but there is a risk. A place like Alcatraz can turn into a haunted house, a thrill ride, a brand. If we only consume it for excitement, we miss the larger truth. Alcatraz is not a story about monsters. It is a story about systems. Systems that decide who gets punished. Systems that decide how punishment should feel. Systems that decide whether harshness is moral or simply satisfying. That is why you cannot talk about reopening Alcatraz without talking about what Alcatraz represents. It represents the temptation to treat punishment like a solution to fear. It represents the belief that if you build something hard enough, you can stop the world from being dangerous. It represents the comfort of imagining that badness can be shipped away. The island is proof that it is never that simple. A prison can hold people. It cannot hold the forces that create crime. It cannot hold poverty. It cannot hold trauma. It cannot hold the politics that decide who gets labeled dangerous. And it cannot hold a society's appetite for spectacle. Chapter 18. The final argument. What Alcatraz really is. When a politician says reopen Alcatraz, they are not talking about engineering. They are talking about emotion. They are borrowing a symbol built in the 20th century and treating it like a timeless answer. But Alcatraz is not timeless. It is a product of specific fears and specific politics. The federal prison era began in 1934, in a country anxious about organized crime and public order. It ended in 1963, in a country facing rising costs and decaying infrastructure. Then, the island became a site of protest. Then it became a national park. Then it became a museum. Now it is a symbol again, dragged back into argument. This is how power works. It recycles icons. And this is why architecture matters. Not because buildings are beautiful, but because buildings are stubborn. They remain long after the people who built them are gone. And as long as they remain, they can be used. Alcatraz can be used to teach empathy. It can be used to glorify punishment. It can be used to discuss indigenous rights. It can be used as a cautionary tale about myth-making. The island does not choose. We do. If Alcatraz teaches one lesson, it is this. Places do not just hold people. Places hold stories. And stories can imprison a society as effectively as steel bars imprison a man. Chapter 20, The Men Behind the Headlines, Famous Prisoners, and an Unfamous Purpose. It is easy to think Alcatraz was built for celebrities of crime. The names are loud. Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, Arthur Doc Barker. The Federal Bureau of Prisons makes an important point about this. Most men sent to Alcatraz were not famous gangsters. They were prisoners who refused to follow rules elsewhere, men viewed as violent, dangerous, or likely to escape. Alcatraz was a control tool, a place to remove disruption from the wider federal system. But famous inmates mattered because they fed the story. A prison needs a face. The public needs a villain. So the institution became a stage, and the press provided the spotlight. Take Al Capone. When he arrived on Alcatraz, the point was to strip him of influence. In other prisons, officials believed he had been able to buy favors and keep power. On the island, the message was clear. No special treatment. No empire. No phone calls that move money. Just routine and humiliation. That is another reason Alcatraz became famous. It promised not only punishment, but equality inside punishment. A famous criminal would be treated like a number, but even that promise was part of the performance. Because power always performs. It performs fairness. It performs toughness. It performs certainty. Alcatraz was built to be seen, even if the inmates were meant to be unseen. Chapter 21, The Most Violent Days. The Battle of Alcatraz. We talk about Alcatraz as if it were quiet, as if it were always a cold machine that simply counts bodies. But there were moments when the machine shook. In early May 1946, an escape attempt escalated into a violent siege that later became known as the Battle of Alcatraz. The incident involved inmates obtaining weapons and taking hostages. What followed was a desperate standoff, confusion, and blood. 2 correctional officers were killed. Many were wounded. The escape failed, but it left a scar in the institution's memory. The Bureau of Prisons later noted that 2 men who were caught were executed for their role in the death of a correctional officer during the Battle of Alcatraz. Why does this matter for our story? Because it reveals something we tend to forget. The more a system insists it has total control, the more catastrophic it looks when control breaks. A small prison riot is a local event. A riot inside the most famous prison in America becomes a national warning. After 1946, the myth of Alcatraz did not collapse. It hardened, it absorbed violence, and turned it into proof. See, people said, it is dangerous in there, so it must be working. That is the logic of punishment culture. Suffering becomes evidence. Harshness becomes a feature, not a flaw. But inside the walls, a different lesson was being learned. A lesson about engineering. A lesson about maintenance. A lesson about time. Alcatraz was aging, and salt never stops. Chapter 22, The Real Enemy. Rust, rot, and the cost of an island. When the public imagines Alcatraz, they imagine bars and guns. When administrators looked at Alcatraz, they saw invoices. Running a prison on an island is like running a ship that never sails. Everything you need must be delivered. Everything you throw away must be removed. Every repair requires planning. Every emergency becomes a logistical nightmare. The island had no source of fresh water. Historical reports quoting federal prison officials describe that nearly 1 million gallons of water had to be barged to the island each week. Think of that. An entire ocean around you, and not a drop you can drink. So, you import life, gallon by gallon. And water was only one piece. Fuel had to be shipped. Food had to be shipped. Equipment had to be shipped. If a boiler failed, you could not send a technician across town. You had to move him across the bay. As the buildings deteriorated, the costs rose. Salt air corroded metal. Moisture attacked concrete. The island demanded constant attention. By the early 1960 seconds, the federal government faced a choice: spend millions to keep the institution alive, or close it and build elsewhere. The Bureau of Prisons said that millions of dollars were needed just for restoration and maintenance work to keep Alcatraz open. So the decision to close came, and the Bureau of Prisons emphasized that it was made long before the June 1962 escape. The escape did not cause the closure, but it did something else. It made the closure feel inevitable to the public. A prison that was supposed to be unbreakable had produced uncertainty. A prison that was expensive had become embarrassing. And embarrassment is expensive in a different way. So the system shut down the stage. Chapter 23. Rehook. The day the rock went silent. Imagine being one of the last inmates on Alcatraz. You have lived by routine. You have lived by counts. You have lived by the sound of keys. Then one day, the routine changes. Not because you earned freedom, because the institution is ending. On the 21st of March 1963, the federal prison closed. The last inmates were transferred away. The rock did not fall. It simply went quiet. And when a famous place goes quiet, the imagination gets louder. Chapter 24. The years in between. Abandoned history and the fight to control it. After closure, Alcatraz entered a strange in-between era. It was not a prison. It was not yet a museum. It was a collection of buildings on a rock, exposed to weather and neglect. Abandoned places attract people. Some come to explore. Some come to steal. Some come because they want to say they touched a forbidden place. History is fragile in the years after its use ends. A famous building can die quietly through neglect. Rust will do what bulldozers do, just slower. But Alcatraz had one advantage. It was already a national symbol. Symbols create political pressure. Pressure to preserve. Pressure to interpret. Pressure to decide who the place belongs to. That pressure is what set the stage for the next transformation. Not a transformation led by wardens or criminals, but by activists. Chapter 25. We hold the rock, the occupations, and the long argument. The National Park Service tells a deeper Alcatraz story that begins before the federal prison. Indigenous people lived in the region for thousands of years before European exploration. Oral histories suggest the island was used in different ways, including as a place of isolation or ostracization, as a gathering area, and even as a hiding place for those trying to escape the California mission system. The NPS also notes that many American Indians were incarcerated on Alcatraz when it became a prison site. One of the largest single groups arrived in January 1895, when 19 Hopi, described as Moki Hopi in historical language, were shipped to Alcatraz. Then comes a detail that changes how we see 1969. There were multiple occupations. On the 9th of March 1964, 5 Sikangu Lakota landed on Alcatraz and declared it Indian land, citing treaty language about deserted federal land. That occupation lasted only 4 hours, but the idea did not fade. It inspired what came next. On the 9th of November 1969, Richard Oakes, an Akwesasne Mohawk, and supporters made a symbolic claim. Then, on the 20th of November 1969, the symbolic act became a full-scale occupation that would last 19 months, until the 11th of June 1971. The NPS describes the occupation as organized in its early phase. A council formed. Jobs were assigned. Security, sanitation, childcare, school, housing, cooking, laundry. Decisions were made by unanimous consent. Demands included an Indian university, a cultural center, and a museum. The federal government responded in a way that reveals the complexity of power. At first, it insisted the occupiers leave. Then it placed an ineffective blockade. Then it agreed to negotiations, while also playing a waiting game, hoping support would fade. The occupation faced internal strain. Students returned to school. New groups arrived. Non-Indigenous residents began living on the island, bringing conflict and disorder. A personal tragedy struck when Oakes's 13-year-old stepdaughter fell to her death on the 5th of January 1970, after which he left the island. And then the government turned the screws. The NPS notes that the government shut off electrical power and removed the water barge that had provided fresh water to the occupiers. 3 days after the water barge was removed, a fire broke out on the island and several historic buildings were destroyed. The government blamed the occupiers. The occupiers blamed undercover infiltrators. The argument itself became part of the story. By 1971, with dwindling support, the end came quickly. On the 10th of June 1971, federal marshals and other agents removed the remaining people, using as little force as possible. The occupation was over, but the NPS argues that success or failure should not be judged only by whether demands were met. The deeper goal was to awaken the public and assert the need for self-determination. The occupation helped shift federal policy away from termination and towards self-determination. That is the third door. Memory. Alcatraz was no longer only a symbol of punishment, it was now also a symbol of resistance. And once a place holds both, it becomes impossible to simplify. Chapter 26. The Park Era, How a Prison Became a Lesson. In 1972, Alcatraz became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The National Park Service took on the job of preserving and interpreting a place built for the opposite purpose, not for understanding, but for control. A prison in operation tries to erase complexity. It tells one story, obey or suffer. A historic site does the reverse, at least when it is honest. It exposes layers. It asks visitors to sit with contradictions. On the island, you can stand near the ruins of the warden's house, a reminder that comfort and confinement once lived side by side. You can look at the lighthouse, a reminder that light and captivity share roots here. You can walk through the cell house and feel how narrow the world becomes when walls do not move. And you can read the words left by activists, evidence that history did not end in 1963. It changed form. This is why Alcatraz survives as a public site, because it offers something rare. A single place where multiple American stories collide. Military expansion, federal power, crime panic, institutional decay, indigenous activism, tourism, memory, and politics. Chapter 27. The 2025 Proposal. Why the symbol still works. Now we return to the present-day moment that opened this story. In May 2025, President Donald Trump announced plans to rebuild and reopen Alcatraz as a prison, directing federal agencies to pursue the idea. Major news outlets reported the announcement and the backlash. Critics pointed out that Alcatraz is now a heavily visited national park, and that reopening it would face enormous logistical, legal, and financial obstacles. Even if nothing comes of the proposal, it matters that it appeared, because it shows the symbol still has power. Alcatraz is a shortcut in the political imagination. It offers an image of certainty without the hard work of policy. It offers the fantasy that dangerous people can be isolated and forgotten. It offers the comfort of a hard line. But the real Alcatraz story warns us against that comfort. Alcatraz was expensive. Alcatraz was decaying. Alcatraz was not a magical solution. It was a small institution with a giant reputation, a stage that performed certainty while fighting rust in the background. And the most famous moment in its history is not a moment of control. It is a moment of uncertainty. 3 men vanished into fog and water. The state could not produce a clean ending. That is why Alcatraz still haunts the imagination. Not because it proves the state is all-powerful, but because it reveals the opposite. Even the hardest symbol can crack. When you understand that, you can see Alcatraz for what it truly is. Not a solution. A mirror. Chapter 28. The Arrival. How the Rock introduced itself. To understand why Alcatraz became a legend, you have to imagine the first day. On the 11th of August, 1934, the first group of federal prisoners arrived at Alcatraz, transforming the island from a former military prison into the most famous high-security penitentiary in the country. That date matters because it is the moment the myth begins in public time. Newspapers could put a line on the calendar. The Rock is open. The Rock is ready. The Rock is different. A prisoner did not arrive at Alcatraz the way a prisoner arrived at a normal facility. He arrived by water. You would step onto a boat with guards and engines and wind. The city would shrink behind you. The sound of traffic would fade into open air. Then the island would grow larger, not like a welcome, but like a warning. The dock did not feel like a front door. It felt like a checkpoint, a narrow entry into a controlled world. You walked uphill. The buildings looked severe. The cell house sat above everything. as if to remind you that the island was arranged around one purpose: containment. The process that followed was designed to strip away identity. You were searched. You were issued clothing. You were assigned a number. You were shown rules. You were introduced to routine. The message was not subtle. You do not set the tempo here. The institution sets it. This is the part people forget when they fantasize about Alcatraz as a symbol. Symbols are emotional, but prisons are practical. A prison runs on procedures. It runs on paperwork. It runs on locks, schedules, and compliance. At Alcatraz, those procedures were intensified. The island was meant to hold men considered dangerous or disruptive in other prisons, so staff aimed for a system that left as little space as possible for improvisation. The more predictable the day, the fewer opportunities to hide a plan. But predictability has side effects. A predictable day can calm a population. It can also crush it. If every morning is the same, the mind has fewer places to run. And when the mind cannot run, it either breaks or it begins to focus on one idea. How do I change this? That is the psychological pressure that made Alcatraz famous. Not only the cold water, not only the guard towers, not only the bars, but the sensation that the future is already written. A prisoner could hear the city. Sometimes he could hear foghorns. Sometimes he could hear music drifting across the bay on a good day. And every sound became an insult, a reminder that life continues without you. For many inmates, the hardest part was not violence. It was the slow erosion of autonomy. You eat when the whistle says. You walk when the count is cleared. You work where you are assigned. You speak when speaking is allowed. You exist as a moving object inside someone else's design. This is why, for all its fame, Alcatraz was not built for comfort. It was built for compliance. And that is also why escape became the central obsession. Because escape was not only about freedom, escape was about proving you still had a will. In a place engineered to remove choice, even the act of imagining an escape was a way to reclaim a small piece of yourself. That is why so many men studied the seams, the vents, the tool rooms, the schedules, the blind spots, the tide. The island was trying to teach them one lesson: you cannot win. But the human mind is stubborn. It hears that lesson, and it answers with a question. What if you are wrong? That question is the engine of every Alcatraz story. It is the engine of the Battle of Alcatraz. It is the engine of the June 1962 escape. It is the engine of every tourist who steps into a cell and asks, how did anyone survive this? Alcatraz made itself famous by promising finality. Then it spent the rest of its life producing doubt. Interlude: what it would take to put prisoners back on the rock. When people talk about reopening Alcatraz, they often picture a simple switch. Turn the key, unlock the doors, bring back the uniforms, bring back the inmates. But the real Alcatraz story teaches the opposite. A prison is a living system, and Alcatraz was never an easy system. It would not just be about rebuilding cells. It would be about building an entire city of infrastructure on a rock. Power, water, sewage, heating, staff housing and transport, medical services, emergency response. Everything that a modern facility requires, delivered across cold water every day. That is why the closure in 1963 matters so much. It is proof that symbolism cannot defeat logistics. Even at the height of its reputation, the prison could not out-argue corrosion and cost. And it is why the island is so revealing as a political symbol. Because it tempts us to confuse the feeling of toughness with the reality of governance. It tempts us to treat punishment like theater rather than policy. It tempts us to believe that if the image is strong enough, the plan must be strong too. But Alcatraz has always been two things at once. It is a stage where the government performs certainty, and it is a machine that constantly threatened to break down. If you remember that, you can hear the deeper warning inside the Alcatraz myth. The warning is not about prisoners. It is about us. It asks a quiet question. Do we want solutions, or do we want symbols that make us feel safe? Chapter 29. Closing. The sentence that should stay with you. Alcatraz began as a rock for seabirds. It became a fortress. It became a lighthouse. It became a military prison. It became a federal penitentiary. It became a mystery. It became a protest stage. It became a museum. And now it has become a political symbol again. That is why it will not die. Alcatraz is not frightening because it was harsh. Many prisons are harsh. Alcatraz is frightening because it shows how easily a society can turn fear into architecture, then call that architecture justice. So here's the final thought, a thought worth carrying with you the next time you hear someone say, "We need a place like Alcatraz again." The scariest thing is not the rock. The scariest thing is the moment we start to enjoy the idea of locking people away on it. And